Jesus Fuentes of EXP, who is a diamond sponsor, who will introduce the session and speakers. Jesus.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I have the pleasure to introduce two of my good friends. They inspire me, so I'm gonna, I'm glad that they're here to present and inspire us as well. So Chris and Melissa Bruntlett, they're Dutch Canadians, and they're authors and they're urban mobility advocates who strive to communicate the benefits of sustainable transport and inspire happier, healthier, and more human-scale cities. Their first two books, Building the Cycling City, The Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality, and the second book, The Curbing Traffic, The Human Case for Fewer Cars in Our Lives, explore how urban and transportation planning decisions helped establish the Netherlands as a cyclist paradise, how North American cities and communities can translate these ideas to build their own cycling paradise, and why creating more space for people of all ages and abilities, regardless of the gender, improves the physical, mental, and social health of a city. Professionally, Melissa is the founder of Modacity Creative, an international independent consultancy that bridges the gap between creative thinking and behavior change to develop projects with positive social impact. Chris, as an international relations manager for the Dutch Cycling Embassy, uses his knowledge and passion to share practical lessons for global cities wishing to learn more from the Netherlands' extraordinary success. Together, I call them the super couple. They continue to be inspired by their home, the new home in Delft in the Netherlands, watching their children and countless others enjoy the quality of life only possible by an environment that allows them to be people first, including, and they're working in a third book about women leadership in urban transformation, coming in late 2025. We don't know, but without further ado, my friends Chris and Melissa Bruntlett.
We're going to switch it up a bit and speak with mics instead of behind the podium to hopefully keep your attention and keep you awake till lunch. Hopefully you've had a coffee injection or tea injection if that's your preference. So first of all, I want to thank Ren and the team at UHP for helping to organize this, and of course to Valerie and West Palm Beach TPA for bringing us here. Chris has had the pleasure of being here 2 years prior, digitally as a speaker and on the stage, and I'm happy to be able to join him to be able to talk to you about this global shift in urban vitality and what that looks like. We have seen a lot of examples already of what great work is happening here in the United States, and we hope to keep inspiring you with some work that's happening around the globe with these ideas of urban transformation.
Okay. So Melissa and I will celebrate 20 years of marriage this year, and thank you. When we look back on that journey, and it really has been an incredible journey, and I think in putting this presentation together, we really appreciated the connecting tissue, the underlying concept that really drove a lot of our personal and professional decisions was this idea of urban vitality. Our decision to move out to Vancouver on the west coast of Canada was in the pursuit of a more livable built environment. The decision to first travel to the Netherlands as tourists, to write a few blog posts that ultimately resulted in our first book, The Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality, and then our decision to follow our dream jobs and the possibilities of living and working in the Netherlands for the last 6 years, and now to work for organizations that travel around the world to help them interpret and translate best practice from the Netherlands onto their own streets.
So let's start out with what is urban vitality. It's the theme of this summit today. It's what a lot of people are talking about. And when digging into the definition, we found that the wonderful Jane Jacobs was the first to coin this term as a quality of space that is attractive for a variety of people at a variety of times to do a variety of activities. So places that are inviting for everyone in our community to come, spend time, and enjoy and have joy in their city. And we've added on a variety of modes because, as has already been discussed today, how people arrive and having a multitude of abilities to arrive in a space or move around a community is just as important as the quality of the experience in that space.
But if we contrast that definition of urban vitality with the vast majority of places we've built in the 20th century in cities around the world, we see that there's a stark difference in terms of, well, we've dedicated 3/4 of our public realm to one function, that is the movement of private automobiles from our houses to our offices, to the expense of everybody else and everything else along those corridors. And really, Jane Jacobs, again, captured the sentiment perfectly. We've confused the idea of solving the problems of traffic with solving the needs of cities. So there is now a rebalancing, I think. One of the great tasks of the 21st century is reclaiming that public realm, at least in part, for the people that live, work, and play in those cities.
So to start out with, why do we need urban vitality? Why is it important to what we're doing? Why should we be discussing it? And really, for a lot of the work that Chris and I do around storytelling and narrative building, it's understanding who it is that we're trying to impact with our decision making, whose lives it is we're trying to make better. And that ultimately begins with our children. We focus a lot on child-friendly cities because it's where we all begin. Many of us in this room will probably harken back to a time when children had more freedom. Why don't kids get outdoors anymore? Why don't they go out and call on their friends? And unfortunately, because of the way that we've been designing our streets to prioritize the movements of automobiles, we've shifted from what was once an outdoor generation to a backseat generation. And that's having knock-on effects on not just the autonomy and freedom in terms of physical movement for our children, but also greater levels of anxiety, feelings of isolation, and higher levels of depression. And what we can do with urban vitality is we can shift that thinking back, hopefully, for this generation of children and the generation of children to follow, to give them that freedom back, to create places for play, to combat the impacts on mental and social well-being, to really create cities that allow children to thrive, to learn how to be risk takers, to find adventure, and to connect with their communities.
Moving from one end of the demographic bracket to the other, as Mitchell so eloquently explained, we have a silver tsunami on its way, and we haven't really reckoned with what that means for the way that we've designed our cities. We've designed our streets, our built environment, with the assumption that we're going to be able to drive forever, and the fact of the matter is we can't. The American Automobile Association says we outlive our ability to drive safely by about 7 to 10 years, and for that decade, at the end of our lives, in places that are dependent on the car, we are housebound, we are institutionalized, we are dependent on others for our mobility needs. So there really needs to be a reprioritization of how our streets function and how our mobility systems function to allow us to age gracefully in place, hopefully in the communities where we grew up, rather than sticking us in care homes on the outskirts of the cities.
Shifting from there to, from age, looking at now caregiving cities. One thing that we've heard a lot today is how mobility and transportation can help facilitate how we get to and from work. And that's important, it's vital for the economy, it's vital for how we maintain our functions in society, but we need to also recognize the role that mobility plays in care for children, care for our elder adults, care for each other, and that can only be done when we again, look at that variety of modes of how people move. It's not just about the trip from A to B, but it's also the trip to C, back to A, maybe over to D, getting kids to school, picking up groceries. All of these activities that we do that are the foundation of the work of care. And so for a caregiving city, it really is allowing for those combinations, those variety of modes to ensure that a network approach that connects all the ways that we can move with all the things that we need, with all the places we want to spend time, really makes for a much more welcoming and inclusive space.
So when we start talking about the idea of deprioritizing traffic, we often get the same pushback. And sometimes it's in good faith, sometimes it is in bad faith. But we often hear, what about people with physical disabilities? Aren't they reliant on a car to get around? Aren't you putting them at a disadvantage through the infrastructure that you're building? And we have to push back on that idea, because when we start digging into the statistics and the lived experience of a lot of people with disabilities, the statistics out of the United Kingdom, for example, are that 60% of people with a disability do not have access to a daily automobile versus 29% of the population. And we find that that's not exactly true. They're not a single amorphous blob, but we have to, of course, start looking at how we can enable people with a physical disability to use the mobility device of their choice. The picture on your screen is a perfect example. The scootmobile is ubiquitous on the streets of the Netherlands because a safe, separated cycle path has been provided for the people, in this case our good friend Maya with multiple sclerosis, who do not have access through physical means, through financial means, to their own automobile.
Dee has already talked about this in the earlier session about this connectivity of modes, and this is again so vital. In that term, in that pursuit of urban vitality, it's not just about the car to get us from our home to our work. It's about, or the public transit, but it's also that walk from our home to that mobility hub. It's the cycle ride to get us there. And the more we can fine-grain those networks to connect with each other, to make it seamless, we allow for greater prosperity for all the trips that we might take. So whether it's accessing education, employment, healthcare services, social engagements, the more we can look at how to combine those networks, the more prosperous we are as individuals, the more we ensure that those that can't maybe afford to purchase a car to get from A to B have the option without locking them into that financial burden. In the States, for example, that looks like $12,000 per year for household for what cost of an operation of one motor vehicle. And for more underserved or lower income communities, that might mean a significant chunk of their take-home income in their house. And so the more we can give them options that help to alleviate that, the more prosperous they are, the more prosperous we all are.
And then finally, tying some of these themes together, there is, again, through this focus on the traffic engineering profession, we've essentially prioritized the people creating traffic over the people that live and shop and play next to it. And so we can draw a direct correlation between reducing the speed, the intensity, the weight of automobile traffic and the amount of social connectivity along that corridor. The slower the cars, the fewer the automobiles, the greater sense of pride that people have in that particular space. The more likely they are to get outside, to meet their neighbors, to spend time in the public eye, in the public realm. And inversely, we know in corridors with very high traffic, they retreat from what is perceived to be a very hostile environment, often living subconsciously in the back of their house away from those threats. So this becomes one of the great tasks, again, of the 21st century in cities where we have a loneliness epidemic, is to create more public space, and that really begins with the way that we look at our streets.
Okay, so we've talked about why. Why is it that we need to do this? Who is benefiting? What does that look like? And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen some wonderful examples already in the previous presentations of what that looks like in the USA. We're going to provide you some international examples of what that's looking like. And what I want you to remember as we go through these, oftentimes we can hear, oh, that's Europe or that's Latin America. It's totally different from our context. What urban vitality looks like will be different because it's based on context, geography, the needs of the people, but there's inspiration that you can draw from that, so I hope that's what we can provide you here.
We begin in Barcelona, which is actually where we started with the first chapter of the new book. A city that I think is really reprioritizing what are large expanses of asphalt that run through the center of the city. It was, for those of you who have visited, built in a typical North American grid pattern, which means that there's not a lot of public space and not a lot of green space for the residents of Barcelona. So the Superblocks program in particular, if we want to start the video, has reclaimed that one intersection at a time, not by the banning of automobiles outright, but just the reduction in the speed and the intensity of the motor traffic, reducing it to about 10 miles per hour, and rethinking that intersection as a public space with planter boxes, with furniture. And this is a Sunday afternoon when we were lucky enough to visit. You can see, if we look at the textbook definition of urban vitality, a variety of users, a variety of times a day, a variety of modes of transportation, a variety of activities, this really checks all the boxes and provides a blueprint for cities that may want to think about creating new public space in places where they're not immediately obvious. Barcelona is also home to the bike bus movement, and we've had lots of conversations, great conversations this week about the nascent bike bus movement here in Southeast Florida. There, we were lucky enough to join 100 children on a Friday morning, all cycling joyfully through the streets of Barcelona. A form of protest, but one that makes the children visible, that shows the need for safer streets, safer infrastructure, and is creating a movement, a network of parents that are pushing the municipality for the ability. In an ideal world, the bike bus movement wouldn't need to exist, but in the meantime, they are putting kids front and center in this push. The municipality has started reacting, and they are one of the more ambitious school streets programs in the European Union. To date, they have protected, is the phrase that they use, transformed the space out of over 200 elementary schools. But it's not just about getting the kids to and from school safely. These have become, again, community assets where the elderly gather on the weekends, where kids were playing football on a Saturday afternoon. The rethinking of the space outside of the elementary school, not just for pickup or drop-off, but as an asset to the community, has really been transformational. And the plan long-term there is to transform all 600 elementary schools in Barcelona by the end of the decade.
So moving east in Europe, I'm going to take you to Albania, to Tirana, which historically is actually quite a young city. It has a long, rich history that goes back centuries, but in terms of its establishment, it's still relatively young and also hosts a young population. And so when the current mayor and council came in, they decided to focus on the well-being of children in their policies and how they were approaching their city. And the very first project of that was a large playground in the Grand Park of Tirana, which is considered the green lung of the city, because there were no places for children to play. There were no places for them to experience joy and to have activity. And so this playground, which did, like many projects, experience a lot of pushback from the community, was still pushed through and became a playground for children from 6 months to 16 years. So not just focusing on how young children experience the city, but also teens like you see here, which I emphasize to all of you, consider the importance of the teens in your communities, because they, just as much as young children, need places to play and places to be social, and this is what we were seeing throughout the park during our visit there. Continuing on with the well-being of children, much like Barcelona, much like many other cities around the world, they also invested in school streets. That started out, again, as one pilot project to reimagine a space. The deputy mayor there, Anwela Rastani, said what she was seeing was children running out of school after a day of learning, feeling very enthusiastic, chatting with all their friends, to a wall of parked cars. And you can imagine what that might do. They run out and they're all excited, and suddenly it's like, oh, where's mom? I can't see anything. The cars are too big. So they started out with reclaiming a little bit of space, adding some greening, removing parking. They currently have several schools throughout the city, but have just last year committed to €1 million more to implement the school programs at 20 more schools around the city to hopefully help to benefit more kids throughout the community. And as Chris said, also create that community asset for intergenerational connection. And then finally, like a lot of cities, Tirana is looking at how to reclaim that public space as a space for people as opposed to moving cars. And the greatest example of that in Tirana is Skanderborg Square, which was formerly the home to a 4-lane roundabout and now looks like this. This is a Thursday evening where we see lots of families moving around, lots of people sitting and enjoying the space. There are cafes around us. This is also home to the National Museum and other important landmarks. But this is now a community asset. It's a bit of a living room for the community. There's a young boy that while we were here, there he is, walking around playing a drum because he can. And I think this is a wonderful example of what urban vitality can be and how we can transform spaces to be really a public asset for the community. And we feel very privileged to have been able to experience that.
Moving on to North American shores, the beautiful city of Montreal, a city that's near and dear to our hearts. We have a lot of family and friends there. And in recent years, under the leadership of Mayor Valérie Plante, it has created one of the more ambitious car-free pedestrianization schemes on the continent. It was, again, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but really led by the business community who wanted to give shoppers a reason to frequent these corridors. And with a little injection of cash and some political leadership from City Hall, they've transformed 11 of these corridors from May to September on a seasonal basis as places where people want to spend time to walk their dog, to let their children play, to maybe have a dinner out in the evening. And it's 9 kilometers of streets in total that have been pedestrianized. It's really unthinkable in North America when you visit there, because it really does feel like a European village with everybody outside. And in a city that gets really harsh, really brutal winters, the Montrealers do like to make the most of their summers. Further to that program and policy from the city, there's been a really ambitious also sponge streets or rain garden program, a recognition that Montreal definitely has a stormwater problem especially in the summer months, periods of really heavy rain and which overflows the sewage system. So they've set about creating these new public spaces that are designed to retain and hold the stormwater. We were lucky enough to see a couple. This one is a former gasoline station that has been turned into a mini golf facility for the community, but also is designed with lots of plants and vegetation designed to hold the water. And then lastly, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Montreal's great cycling infrastructure, because it is really one of the great undiscovered cycling cities on this continent. 350 kilometers of fully segregated cycle paths. A traffic engineer that came to Amsterdam in the 1980s and was inspired to get building long before cities were even thinking about this topic. And in recent years now, under, again, the leadership of Mayor Plante, they're set about building another 300 to 400 kilometers, but really not just tacking them onto the sides of the streets, but designing them in a really holistic and thoughtful manner with vegetation, with rain guards, with shade trees, with furniture, and transforming Montreal into a city where people, really are a sense of pride and ownership of their public realm.
Moving on to Latin America, much like Montreal is investing in cycling, Bogota, Colombia has quite a rich history of cycling. One of the first city to launch a ciclovia, which is still running, if you haven't been, still running to this day, which is a wonderful celebration every Sunday. But what is important about Bogota is that they're looking at cycling not just in terms of where it makes sense on very populous corridors where you have the universities or lots of employment institutions, but also looking at how to apply that same thinking of providing safe, comfortable cycling in more underserved communities. So when we were there, we were able to travel to what is largely an informal housing community where they had the same types of facilities. And I remember that experience being so impactful as we're standing there watching, because I often hear cycling infrastructure is just for those that are already cycling or those that with the most privilege. And what I saw there is families of all sizes cycling together, business vendors cycling on adapted bikes, children cycling on here, and I thought to myself, this is the proof that when we build for cycling, regardless of where it is, we're making sure that we're providing that vitality and access to everybody. And that extends to public transport and thinking about how in Bogota they can help their citizens to access that prosperity I mentioned earlier. Not just in terms of the city core itself, but you see, like most Latin American cities, the housing spreading up into the mountainside with lots of informal communities, where some of those people who are coming into the center to provide a lot of service work are traveling 2 to 3 hours each way to access their employment. And so the investment in the aerial trams, as you see here, more investment in rapid transit through bus, but also through light rail and intercity rail, is ensuring that as a city, Mayor Lopez, who was there to implement this, and the incoming leadership now are looking at how to ensure that that vitality is maintained, not just for the people that live close to the center, but the people that are providing a lot of the services to everyone in the city center. And then finally and crucially, one ingredient in that is understanding the role of care, again, in that city. Bogota has a challenge where a lot of women drop out of school, don't finish their education because they become carers. They're looking after families, and they just don't have time. And so what Mayor Lopez and her team decided to do was to invest in these care blocks that are located near transport centers to provide training and education to these women, so if they wanted to pursue employment or they wanted to finish their high school degree, they could. But crucially, they were also providing those care services. So the things that were stopping them from finding work or finding these services are there in terms of childcare for young children, removing that burden so they can focus on advancing their own career development, laundry services, care for older dependents, all within this community hub that really helps to bolster and create that foundation for further prosperity for women and men in Bogota.
So the last stop on our Whistle Stop Global Tour, well, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Paris, because Paris has really captured international headlines for the way that it has transformed its own streets in the last decade under the leadership of Mayor Anne Hidalgo. It really started as kind of an ad hoc movement, little temporary installations, the Paris beaches along the river of the Seine each summer. That was a motorway that moved tens of thousands of cars, would be turned into a beach each summer. The iconic Champs-Élysées under the Paris Breathes program was made car-free the last Sunday of every month, just to give Parisians a taste of what their streets could look like when they start thinking about these corridors as not necessarily places to pass through, but places to pass time. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and Mayor Hidalgo and her team were really off to the races. Hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of dedicated cycling infrastructure were built almost overnight using really light, quick, cheap materials. The iconic Rue de Rivoli became all but car-free for pedestrians, cyclists, and scooters. And this is really, a momentum now that is unstoppable in more recent years, that coming out of the pandemic has been central to complementing what is a great public transport system, but is now verged to become one of the world's greatest cycling cities after Amsterdam and Copenhagen. And then we have what Mayor Hidalgo referred to as her sweet revolution. That is a school streets program that is probably the most ambitious in the world. And it is about, again, reimagining these spaces outside of elementary schools.
I think. Oh, there it wasn't. I thought I could do enough.
Well, rethinking them as places the community wants to spend time. So that's the exact same street before and after. They've transformed 200 of these streets with shade trees, fruit trees, new plants, new furniture, play facilities for the children. And again, you can visit it 7 days a week, morning to dusk, and it's really such a vibrant place in a city that has precious little public space. They are now taking their streets back for the people that live there.
So we've presented a few, just a handful of locations that are building urban vitality back into their communities, and we hope that they're giving you some inspiration of what can be done in Southeast Florida and wherever you're coming from. But we want to look at what the role of leadership is in this, because I'm sure that many of you are aware we have some decision makers and leaders in the room. Leadership is vital to providing this impetus, this boost to make things happen. And in our research, we started to look at what were the secret ingredients for leaders to getting stuff done, to having that urban transformation. And we came down to, there's many, but we narrowed it down to 5 key traits that really help to move the needle and push cities to more successes. And the first is to begin and lead with empathy. What we found in a lot of the people that we spoke to is that it came down to listening to the community. What do you need from your space? Why do you currently move the way you do? Why do you spend time in the spaces that you do? And what do you need from us to help make that possible in more spaces around the city? And bringing a lens of compassion and understanding we're not all coming from the same space, the same experiences, the same knowledge. But the more that we can bring empathy into the conversation and really understand each other, we found that in cities that are doing that, they're seeing the greatest positive impact.
Another common denominator we identified with a lot of the leaders that we were lucky enough to interview was they were thinking far beyond the current political cycle. As was said beautifully earlier, they were planting trees which they didn't necessarily expect to enjoy the shade of. They were thinking, what does this project, what does this initiative mean 10 years from now, 20 years from now, generations from now, when the city has changed, when the world around it has changed. And so if we can, especially the elected officials in the room, encourage you to think it's not necessarily about winning the next election, but leaving a legacy of leadership within your constituency.
And I come back to this idea of valuing the work of care. This is now the 3rd or 4th time I've mentioned it. But it is really important to remember that our cities function not just on how we can drive economic vitality in terms of employment or retail economic vitality, but understanding the work of care is the foundation of our cities. It is how we wake up in the morning and get ready for school. It's how we prepare for our weeks. It's the work that happens invisibly behind the scenes to make sure that we can do the jobs that we do every day. And so our cities also need to value that and value the types of trips and types of spaces and types of people that are doing this work. And what we saw with all of the places that we visited is thinking about the work of care in the greater context of that urban vitality has been critical.
We recognize this is not easy. As soon as you start, as I said earlier, deprioritizing the car or even talking about taking space and privilege away from the automobile, you would think you were proposing the end of the world. And the fact of the matter is, our thesis is this is not necessarily as controversial as people think they are. It comes from a small, intensive minority who are well-connected and well-voiced. And if we do start to think about building consensus, building coalitions, talking to what we perceive to be a silent majority out there, building a coalition of the willing of organizations from the public and the private sector, we can really make the overwhelming case for building more livable cities. And that, at the end of the day, is what we are all here for.
And finally, and Chris hinted at this a little bit, the key ingredient that we found that arguably is one of the most important is that each of the leaders, each of the decision makers, each of the staff that we spoke to prioritized impact over power. And that means making potentially unpopular decisions in the moment, making decisions or making plans that are difficult, but arguably in the long run have the greatest success in terms of restoring urban vitality, making sure cities work for everyone, than the safe decision. And that also means, you know, if you're in an elected position, you were elected to do a job, doing that job in your time, but knowing when there's another voice coming up behind you that can build on that legacy to step aside and let them take the reins. And we see this time again in cities around the world, that the leaders that are willing to do that, willing to work together in the coalitions, but also step aside to make room for new ideas, are seeing greater long-term legacies.
So with that, we will thank you so much for your attention. It's been an absolute joy to share what is a first glimpse at our new book that will be out in the autumn, Women Changing Cities, Global Stories of Urban Transformation. Thank you to Valerie and the Palm Beach TPA for this generous invitation. And I want to end with another plea. I think, again, we often, and this really gets to the heart of what Melissa and I do, is not viewing this as a problem that needs to be solved by other people, and to rethink this as potential that is waiting to be unleashed, potential that's waiting to be realized by all of us working together rolling up our sleeves, and hopefully creating a brighter future. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chris and Melissa, for such an inspiring presentation. One of the things I've always appreciated about this summit in particular is that it's not just a local summit, but and it's not just a national summit, but it really is an international summit. And we always learn from our neighbors, both north and across the pond as well. So thank you all for your perspective. We do have just a couple minutes for questions. Questions are between us and lunch. And so we actually had quite a few responses on Slido, and I'm going to try to put them all together. There were comments that were just so inspired by all of the different wonderful pictures and videos that you shared, but the one in Bogota, someone pointed out with all the diversity of martial arts happening in the background and a quinceañera happening, and just how inspiring that is. And also there are lots of questions and thoughts about sort of now that you've been continents, right? So you've been in Canada, now you're over in Europe. Sort of the lessons we can learn from one another. And so bringing it to the local community, are there any sort of short-term wins that you all see that we might be able to implement here? And then there was also a question tied to that short-term win of how do you convince, outside of the 5 traits, which are wonderful for leadership, how do you convince leadership to be open to non-traditional development ideas?
Yeah. Maybe. I think, when we look at short-term goals, we talked about the child-friendly city, and I think oftentimes that's a place to have the greatest impact in a short amount of time, is look at how we can work with schools and the larger community to make sure that we're finding ways to build that activity back into how kids move. I was just in Pinecrest on Wednesday working on a workshop with some fellow Dutch colleagues that are working on the cycling program and looking at how we can integrate that into potential school mobility for kids. And I think if you talk to a lot of parents, if you bring the community in, I myself participated in a similar program years ago when my kids were very little. They're now an adult and 16, so that was a long time ago. But really, parents have this passion to see their kids benefit, and so if we can, start there, that's the short trips, that's maybe doing temporary transformations, we can start to see maybe a little bit of movement quickly that expands to the larger community as they see the benefits.
Then, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the value, the importance of international exchange, and that's obviously what we're in the business of. We did see the bike immersion program for Miami-Dade winning an award prior to our presentation today. The Dutch Cycling Embassy was really lucky to host what was 35 elected officials from across Southeast Florida in the Netherlands for 3 days, and to see the hearts and minds that were changed simply through the act of walking and cycling through cities in the Netherlands. It was really kind of transformational process for a lot of those elected officials. You don't have to come to the Netherlands. There are plenty of places in North America and Latin America that are also making similar transformations, but seeing really is believing, and there's so much knowledge and experience and inspiration to get out there. It's just maybe you need to look a little bit outside of your patch of grass.
That's great. I do think we have time for one more question. I see a hand over here. Would love to give you a microphone so everyone can hear you, if that's okay. And also, I'd had just a practical question as we're taking the microphone over there. In the one picture you all had, I think it was the Prosperous City, where you had all the bikes. Are you guys impressed by that? I was like, wow, that's a lot of bikes. As someone who grew up in Los Angeles, lived in New York City, was down in Miami, how do you protect from theft? Right? And vandalism. Did anybody else think that? It's like, wow, with all those bikes, would you come back and they would still be there when you got back from work?
This question comes up all the time. And to be honest, if you have biking in your city, you have bike theft. Every city experiences it. What they do in terms of those massive facilities, that one's not the best example, but they do build underground facilities or places where you have attendants. So there's more eyes on the bikes to help to mitigate that. But yeah, I mean, I've had a bike stolen in the Netherlands, unfortunately.
Oh, I was inspired. I was like, that's a very honest community. I love that. And we did have a question over here.
I just wanted to say it's a pleasure to watch the team work together. It's quite inspiring for a couple to be able to communicate as well as you both do.
Thank you.
You mentioned the children in schools. Since we know many children around the world have been affected through COVID and the isolation that they felt not being in school, I think the concept of allowing them to have playtime or find a way to want them to go back to school, maybe in this concept that you're talking about, there's some hope for the future in education and children having connectivity themselves because of what they lost during that period of time. So this sounds like a great concept, and I look forward to seeing how it benefits the next generation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think I would just, you're absolutely right. We watched as when COVID hit, our children were 11 and 13, and we have seen that long-term impact in terms of their isolation and social connectivity. And so it's, of course, getting kids to school where they are going to school is important, but also, as we saw in Tirana, creating those spaces for play, building that back in and looking at that from all ages, I think, I'm going to try not to get emotional, is so important, I think. And not only does that, as I mentioned when I was in Pinecrest, it's not just about the kids, it's also creating that social connectivity for their grandparents, for their parents. And so it's just about making the space for everyone.
All right. You guys are going to be sticking around today. All right. So Melissa and Chris will be around if you have any other questions. So thank you very much.